Okay, everyone, hello and welcome. We are here all together welcoming Gary Maier for a fireside chat on the evolution of the asset management industry from a technology perspective. And Gary's going to share with us the digitization and then potential for decentralization within the industry. So we are very excited to welcome Gary. He has a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I'm just very thrilled that he's going to share some of his insights with us. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gary in order to introduce himself and share a little bit about his background and his entree into the space, and also now what he's doing with financial services organizations.
Thanks, Jeannette. Thanks for having me. Unlike for Beyonce, I don't think there's any risk of us breaking the internet today.
I wouldn't be so sure.
Okay. but putting that aside, I know there's a lot of interest in these topics. So my background is I began my career at Drexel Burnham way back when, and after Drexel collapsed about 2 years or so, maybe a year and a half into my tenure there, due to no fault of my own, I would add. I wound up as the 20th person hired at Blackrock, which was Blackstone Financial Management back in the day. And I was pretty instrumental in the original creation of the Aladdin platform there. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that, so I won't steal any thunder here. After Blackrock, I became the CTO at a couple of hedge funds, again, focused on driving technology initiatives in that part of the buy side, and then returned to Blackrock for a second tour of duty after they had completed the acquisition of BGI and Mellon, and now they had all the iShares product under their umbrella, and much bigger, different firm than when I left it, way back in the mid-90s. And so I was heading up global engineering there, and then ultimately one of my former BlackRock colleagues, who had also returned to a second tour of duty, became the CEO of investment management at BNY Mellon, and brought me in to help lead technology for asset and wealth management globally at the bank. And so very proud of that tenure, there for about 5 years or so, and then ultimately took on a somewhat similar role heading up global asset management tech over at UBS. And then when I left UBS, I had an opportunity to really consider what I wanted to do next, and felt that the industry had generally lagged in terms of its adoption of digital since the early days of my career, and thought that I was somewhat uniquely qualified, given my background and track record, to help drive that journey. And so I wound up launching a consultancy, Fintova, and that's what I'm doing now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about that. And you made an allusion to Aladdin, which I know is something that probably a lot of folks here on the call would love to hear more about. It was a pioneering piece of software when it was first introduced, and it continues to be an area where BlackRock has, a ton of innovation, a ton of effort going into the Aladdin platform. Could you please kind of take us through the genesis of Aladdin? I know that you were part of the initial team putting this together. I'd love to hear a little bit more about those challenges that led to the creation of the Aladdin platform. Like what was it? What problems were you trying to solve with the creation of Aladdin?
Yeah, I mean, unlike common corporate wisdom these days, actually, Aladdin, there was no grand plan for Aladdin in the early days. It actually began as a skunkworks project. And BlackRock back in the early days was a pretty nascent asset manager focused on U.S. domestic fixed income with a very high concentration in mortgage-backed securities and CMOs and products of that ilk. And you really couldn't buy anything off the shelf back then to manage those assets, whether from an operational standpoint or from a risk management standpoint. And BlackRock, I think when they launched, they were very clear that they felt there was an opportunity in that space because of the complexity of the assets, and because, particularly on the buy side, most firms didn't have the technology capabilities or the risk appetite to really manage those assets properly and really understand how the cash flows worked under different scenarios and so forth. And so that part of it was part of their grand plan in the early days. But in terms of system capabilities, there was really nothing out there. And so I had come up with a couple of ideas, and I wrote them down on this diagram that was very much like a modern day Visio, but this was pre-Visio. BlackRock was using SunOS computers basically on all the desktops and in the quote unquote server room, which wasn't much more of a server closet than a server room. So I wrote these ideas down, and I took them to one of the founding partners, who is the head of technology and risk, this gentleman, Ben Golub. And I said to him, I said, I think this is what we should do. And on this workflow, there were, all ways in which the trade flow process would work, and the way in which Monte Carlo simulations would be broadcast across all of the machines that we had and so forth. And sort of early day grid computing. And Ben's response was, well, nobody does anything like this, and oh, by the way, we might be out of business tomorrow. And that's how early it was in BlackRock's lineage. And my response was, well, just because they don't doesn't mean they shouldn't. And I walked out of his office, and I had some partners in the head of operations, who was a big advocate for what we wanted to do, and then also a junior portfolio manager who later became the same guy who hired me into BNY Mellon many years later. And we were all sort of young and single and living in New York, and so we would go out and talk about all these opportunities and capabilities and gaps that we had to fill and so forth. And I began to build out this system, and everything from the database and the data models to I wound up getting tapes from Open Source Foundation to get Motif in on X11, built out the network infrastructure, which in those days was called DMS and is now rebranded as BMS. They still use the same network topology, and basically built the system. And did it largely on my own time in the early days, and then did the other work during the course of the day. I would stay there till really late at night. And eventually we put it out as a prototype on the desktops for the portfolio managers and the operations team and so forth. And it really sort of took off. And the interesting thing too, that I wasn't really part of the commercialization of the Aladdin platform, other than the fact that they began to get a lot of inquiries about it, to the point where 60 Minutes was doing a piece on the fact that you had all of these bankruptcies, Orange County, California, Gibson greeting cards. There were a bunch of others that had been investing in CMO residuals at the time. And they didn't have the aptitude or the capability to really understand that the stated yield on the CMO residual was really not the yield that you were likely to receive, if anything. And so they misvalued these assets. And 60 Minutes came to BlackRock's office and basically did a piece. And one of the things that they highlighted was, these are the systems that you need in order to manage these assets. And they zoomed right in on what was then, it wasn't even branded yet as Aladdin, but what was then the trading platform that had been built. And I think from that point forward, BlackRock recognized there was an opportunity to monetize it. And they really did so, I would say, more so after I left my first tour of duty there. And Charlie Halleck was sort of the brainchild, I think, of the monetization effort, really drove it forward. And it's now the anchor of, $1 billion+ revenue stream for BlackRock. So it's really become quite a significant piece of their business.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear the sort of modest origins of something that has become so impactful today. And it seems like you kind of took that mindset of digital transformation and huge transformative change to subsequent institutions like UBS and BNY Mellon, and then also you returned to BlackRock. So what was it that you saw in terms of parallels between that journey that you took with Aladdin and then taking that knowledge and that innovation spirit to UBS and BNY Mellon?
I think the thing that I was always pretty good at was, first of all, when I started interning on the street when I was 16 and doing software development back then. And in those days, it was on PDP-11s and VAX VMS and all these old digital debt products that don't exist anymore. And so I had the opportunity to learn technology and apply it in the business at a pretty young age. When I went off to college, there really weren't the types of computer science majors that you have today. The maturity of that was really not quite there yet. And my view was that there probably wasn't much that they were going to teach me about software development that I didn't already know from practical experience. And so I actually chose to basically marry those capabilities and those skills by majoring in economics and public policy. So I came out of school with more of a business lens, and I always sought to apply that business lens to anything I did from a technology standpoint. And so for me, it was always about looking at the macro landscape, not just the institutional landscape. The institutional landscape can sometimes be very, very myopic and really inwardly focused on only what's in front of them, and sometimes very task oriented. And so it makes it difficult to be very strategic when you have that sort of narrow field of view. Whereas, the macro landscape allows you to kind of see what's happening around you and also to try to project where the puck is moving, and rather than where the puck has been. And so in the case of Aladdin, a lot of it was about where the puck was moving. As I said, when I presented the original idea to Ben, his response was, nobody does anything like that, right? And I think that that's the same approach that I've always tried to take, whether it was at BNY Mellon or UBS or even today within Fintova, is always trying to understand where's the puck moving and try to build something and project what can you do to help change the industry? What can you help then do to advance your firm in that evolution? And I think when you look at technologies like AI and blockchain, it's a lot of the same kinds of questions. AI has gotten clearly the lion's share of attention recently. It's sort of at the peak of its hype cycle, I would say, at the moment. Blockchain was there a few years back and then lost a little bit of its luster, particularly amongst the crypto winter that we had and all of that. But I also think that there are reasons that AI has progressed to common knowledge versus, like, say, where blockchain is, right? The analogy that I sometimes use for folks is I say, think about the early days of the internet. And I've spoken at conferences where I'll ask people, how many of you remember Archie and Gopher? And maybe one person in the audience will raise their hand and everybody else will kind of not be, be scratching their heads a little bit, right? And I'll say, well, back in the early days of the internet, for researchers and tech geeks like me, Archie and Gopher were the tools of choice to search the web, to search the internet. And but it wasn't for the faint of heart. It wasn't for the layperson. And so it's not something that you necessarily would have been familiar with. And then I'll ask the question, and how many of you remember Mosaic and Netscape? And virtually everybody will raise their hand, unless maybe they're really, really young and that was even, before their time. But most people will raise their hand. And I say, well, that's really what took, the internet in its raw form and made it consumable to the average person. And once that happened, you saw the takeoff of commerce on the internet and audio and video and media content on the internet. And there's really not a thing that you can do today without internet access. And so when I take a look at AI, I will then ask the question of people, because I try to explain, I think this really is sort of the beginning of the next industrial revolution for knowledge workers. And I'll say, I've spoken to people, and some think it's oversold, and some think it's transformational and everything else. And let me tell you why I lean towards the latter. How many of you have used ChatGPT? And everybody raises their hand. And ChatGPT is basically the Mosaic or Netscape of AI. AI has been around for, since the 1950s in various forms. And, blockchain, in contrast, has really been around since, 2008 or 9, I think, when the Bitcoin blockchain was announced, basically. And so it really hasn't had quite as long of a runway as AI has actually had. But what changed the course of sort of put us at the heel of the hockey stick for AI is the fact that everybody now uses it. Everybody now knows what it is, right? And that's the beginning of a massive transformation that's underway. And it's moving quite quickly. So I think blockchain still lacks that killer app that translates to everybody, and that's the thing that has to happen for it to really take off, in my view.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of people really being able to perceive the tangible benefits of AI kind of as soon as you're using something like ChatGPT, which is one of the killer apps, if not the killer app of AI at the moment. And from the perspective of an asset management firm, what are your views on how, specifically in financial services, firms are going to use AI for different areas of business, like operations, service delivery, customer engagement, things like that?
Yeah, well, I think it all starts. Look, there are some obvious things that people talk about with AI, right? A lot of it in the early days has been largely around productivity gains, a little bit more incremental as people are still getting, their feet wet in the space. But I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for it to enhance the client experience, number one. If you take a look at most asset managers today, the industry has faced a tremendous amount of fee and margin compression over the past decade or two, and some of that, much of that, frankly, has been exacerbated by the proliferation of ETFs and the passive model. So active management has struggled a bit in that regard, and in fact, amongst the active managers out there, it's really a small percentage, maybe about 10% or so, actually beat the index on a fairly regular basis. And so it's a hard business, I think, to really justify some of the high fees and the like in as well. I think that alpha generation is clearly the main thing that people talk about as an opportunity. There's a tremendous amount of unstructured alternative data that's out there today that a human being simply can't process. It would take forever to go through, all this data. And so certainly AI has already been used in not necessarily generative AI, but natural language processing, predictive analytics, those types of things have already been used in that space. In terms of operations, it's used in areas even like, exception processing, trying to sort of automate that as much as possible. I think one of the areas where, there are predictive analytics in client engagement and sales and marketing teams, but I think one of the things that's missing in the industry generally is sort of a cohesion across all of these functional units within an asset manager. And on our website, we kind of refer to this as the virtuous data feedback loop. And the idea is that if you look at each one of the business functions within an asset manager, from the client-facing teams to the investment managers to the risk managers to operations, they all basically capture insights and data that's relevant to the full life cycle of the asset management relationship and the products and performance and management and so forth. And but rarely are they shared across those boundaries in any meaningful way. And so if you are, let's say, a traditional asset manager and you're looking to better define your product shelf, so that it meets and maximizes value to, to your prospective clients and your existing clients. Wouldn't it be helpful to know what's happening in the world around you that might drive clients towards a particular type of product suite and or solution set? And so, but it's really not incorporated into the manufacturing process today, and so I think there's a ton of opportunity there, and it's an area where AI can certainly help as well.
And it sounds like to me that that's going to require a reimagining, or at least an updating of data architecture in order to be able to leverage this AI technology in the way that you're describing. So what steps should an organization actually take to ensure that their data architecture supports these future AI use cases?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I say it till my face turns blue sometimes, but data architectural data is the lifeblood of the entire business, and it is certainly the lifeblood of anything that you want to do with AI or even blockchain. The sad truth is that when you go behind the doors of a lot of shops, you find that the data architecture is really sorely lacking or non-existent. And what happens is you have a lot of fragmentation of data, some of it held captive in different endpoint systems, very, very difficult to access. And so some firms have taken the approach of, well, what we need to do is we need to bring this data together in a warehouse or a lake or something of that ilk, and then we can query it more effectively. Well, if you think about what blockchain, for example, represents, right? Blockchain represents a decentralization. What people are still pursuing is kind of a decades-old approach of centralization around their data. And the challenge with standing up any type of warehouse, or lake or anything like that is it's the timeliness of the data, it's the reconciliation of the data, it's you're now creating a copy of the golden source of the data. What happens if that source data changes? How quickly does it make its way out to the warehouse or the lake? And those create quite a few challenges. And it's also creating a tremendous amount of redundancy in your infrastructure. And so, but that's kind of almost the best of breed that a lot of firms have sought to deliver. And it doesn't really, I don't think it really takes the ball forward very much. And when you're thinking about the application of these new technologies like AI, firms are married to their structured data, but a lot of the opportunity really is in the unstructured data that's out there. And so, firms still are disproportionately focused on relational databases that sit inside of their walls or in their vendor applications, whereas there's a tremendous amount of other opportunities and insights to be derived from other types of database structures, from other types of data assets. How do you bring those together? How do you access that? There are discussions around, what's the right architecture. You have to clearly ensure governance and security and permissioning and regulatory requirements. All that stuff has to factor into it as well. But I think that's part of the challenge and the opportunity. I still think, you can't imagine how many firms I speak with, big and small alike, that are still struggling with defining a security master. And this is something that should have been resolved and delivered in a fairly broad way, decades ago. And it's still an issue for a lot of firms. So they're still dealing with a lot of the blocking and tackling issues. I think that's the biggest impediment to adapting these new technologies, quite honestly.
And could we actually dig into a little bit the point you just made about the security master? And then I also want to kind of delve into the idea of data federation a little bit, just to kind of unpack some of these terms a little bit more. So what is the importance of a security master, for example, and why should people be aware of that? Why should that be sort of their first port of call if they're thinking about modernization of their tech stack? And then also thinking about in the context of even like utilizing blockchain technology in the future, how should firms be thinking about data federation?
Well, I mean, I think if you think about the data landscape at most firms today, it's generally transactional data and reference data. And so your reference data, and market data, if you want to sort of separate that out from reference data. But so most firms today, they will have some or many security masters, as the case may be, right? And a lot of times they tend to be tied back to a particular product set that a portfolio manager or desk is using, versus having something that maybe is a little bit broader in terms of its product coverage and use cases. We built one actually at BNY Mellon, years later, which was intended to, we had a boutique organization in the asset management space there. So you had all these vertically integrated boutiques, and we were trying to find ways in which to achieve some economy of scale. And one of the obvious pain points, and also non-controversial pain points, because everybody, kind of wanted to own their own vertical. They didn't want to, offset some of that stuff by using shared infrastructure. That's changed, by the way. I think more firms are open to that because of the cost of managing, a full vertical integration. But so we created a multi-tenant, multi-product security master platform, and we did it, Jeannette, with 3 people initially. Actually, it started off with one guy, and then I made him hire and move over 2 other people. And you contrast this with the amount of people and money that was being spent on the asset servicing side of the house to manage their security master, which didn't have nearly as many attributes in terms of the product set as the asset management one did. And it was a pretty legacy piece of kit. And the interesting thing is that since I've left, that security master has continued to develop and evolve, the one within asset management, to the point where asset servicing ultimately acquired it and is now using it for all of their mid-office outsourcing clients. Which also highlights another point, which is you don't need a ton of people and a ton of money to do really good things. And, I know that there's a lot of talk right now about layoffs in the industry and cost cutting and all this stuff. Sometimes there's plenty of money and it's just poorly spent. And how do you optimize that? But that's an example in terms of security master.
Got it. And in the context of blockchain, I kind of want to shift a little bit and maybe talk a little bit more about how firms are not even currently approaching, because as you mentioned, I think we still are a little ways off before we're going to start to see widespread adoption of blockchain in asset management. However, this concept of integration of shared resources, et cetera, how do you see that evolving as blockchain implementations become more and more common in the industry?
Well, I think the opportunities for blockchain in this industry are like, obviously it's being used in trade finance areas like that, cross-border payments, those types of things. It is a very, very good use case for it. They're still kind of in their infancy, generally, those applications, but it makes a lot of sense to move it to blockchain. I'm also a big believer in, private chain is sort of training wheels. There's really very little value add. It doesn't disintermediate anybody, any participants. It remains a centralized infrastructure. So, given the fact that the transaction throughput isn't as great as, as more traditional databases, what's the point? But public chain is different. And I think that's, those use cases are out there. I actually think that the biggest opportunity for public chain in our industry is really its application towards private market assets, for which, there really is very limited price transparency. There's really no trading exchange mechanism to transact on. And so you could very easily see how blockchain could become sort of the next gen ECN for private markets. That's where I think the biggest opportunity actually lies, notwithstanding cryptocurrencies and things like that. There are a lot of challenges, especially when you try to apply it to real world assets, and some people are doing that as well. But you have to consider all of the legal and regulatory constraints around that. Who will recognize ownership? A lot of the titling process, for example, for real estate is still very paper-based, and it sits inside of municipalities where there's not a lot of technology competencies readily available to adapt change. And so what people have generally done is they sort of created these shadow proxies of assets in a tokenized form on the chain. And then they try to tie those back to the physical world on the back end. And so it's kind of a halfway house, I think, at the moment. But to really move it forward, I think a lot of that legal and regulatory challenges, they have to be addressed.
And you mentioned, I love this idea of the private chain as training wheels. Would you say that that is currently the most realistic path towards potential use of tokens on a public chain for an institution? Or what would you say is a realistic practical path if there are firms that want to start dipping a toe into blockchain?
Yeah, I think we're a lot of firms that are playing in the space. I think they've begun to get past some of the private chain consortiums that are out there, and they are making their way towards the public chain. Very often, Ethereum is kind of the big platform for DeFi. Solana's out there as well, but it doesn't have the audience yet, let's say, that Ethereum has, right? And what I think a lot of firms are doing, and I think it makes sense, is rather than developing directly to the Ethereum main chain, the mainnet, they are basically using a layer 2 like Polygon to go after it, right? So you're going to get improved performance, you're going to get lower gas fees. The analogy is almost like having a subledger that ultimately posts to a general ledger, right? And so you can sort of think as Polygon as the subledger here. So I think that's what they're doing increasingly. The thing that I think has to take off as well in a more meaningful and broad way is zero knowledge proofs, because for identity. And I think when that happens, it's a challenge right now, in terms of how do you prove who you are and all this kind of stuff without divulging, the anonymity that you want to maintain. I think that ZKP is kind of one of the building blocks that has to be proliferated in a greater sense for it to really take off. I think that's a key thing.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that hopefully we'll start to see a few tiger teams out there, like you were describing, groups of 2 and 3 people within financial institutions that are working on these solutions. Like they're already out there. And I hope that we can start to see more and more of these groups kind of exploring this area. And that also takes me to something else that you said that I wanted to explore a little bit more, which was it does not take a lot of people to achieve great things and make great innovative strides. So I'd love to get your perspective on how firms can optimize their resource allocation and kind of do a lot with innovation on perhaps smaller budgets, or at least be budget conscious when they're innovating. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. The more mature the organization, the more challenging it is to overcome spending habits, right? And when I arrived at BNY Mellon, for example, I inherited a budget that was about 85% BAU, business as usual activities, right? So that's maintenance, basically. 15% of it was called strategic, but you'd be hard pressed to really define much of that as really strategic. It was incrementalism in most cases at best. And so one of the things that I did early on was we were coming up to the next budget cycle, and I also wanted to see how the organization was performing. How responsive was it to the user base and all of that? And I tried to adapt a philosophy there, which was very entrepreneurial in nature, right? If you're an entrepreneurial shop, you're hungry to earn the next piece of business. You're going to put whatever effort and into it to make sure that happens. You want to make sure that you're pleasing your customers at the end of the day, especially if you don't have some large moat that kind of holds them captive after you win them. And so what I would say to the team is I'd say, look, we basically want people to use us because we're delivering great things. And in as much as we're a captive, right, we don't want them to use them because they have to use us. So they should be able to drop us out of the bank on the street where we have no longer any affiliation with the bank, and people should still want to use us. And if they don't, then we're probably not doing a very good job, right? And sort of that was kind of the approach that I took to sort of change the culture a little bit, right, towards one of a little bit more innovation and commercialization, and commercial viability is what I call the concept. And then we went through the zero-based budgets, and the idea there is basically, rather than looking at last year's spend and kind of doing a marginal incremental adjustment, up or down, you lose track, you lose visibility into actually the efficacy of the team or the project, or is it worthwhile even putting any money into it anymore? And so we went through that process, and there was just a ton of waste that you could identify, to the point where I'm not proud of this because it affects people's lives, and it was very difficult, but we got to the point where, without any type of headcount targets or anything like that imposed upon us from above, we wound up in one day, we reduced our staff by a third, and that included FTEs as well as contract resources. And before we pulled the trigger, I had very long-standing members of my management team that were telling me, we'll never be able to do this, we'll never be able to survive, how are all these projects going to continue to move forward? And my view was that if it's costing us $1 million to roll out a basic brochureware website, which is more or less what the internal chargebacks were looking like, well, we shouldn't be doing that work, because we can probably do that with a couple of guys on a weekend, far less than $1 million. So we went through that process. We didn't backfill. We did hire back a couple of people, well, not hire back, but we brought in a couple of new people that I thought would be culture carriers and change agents, and upskilled a little bit. And what I'll tell you, Jeannette, is that by the next year, our BAU versus strategic portfolio was about 50-50. And on top of that, we did not skip a beat on any of the maintenance stuff. And then further to that, the user base had a newfound respect for what could be delivered out of the technology organization that they did not have for quite some time. So we were beginning to innovate, we were beginning to deliver some new strategic capabilities, and a lot of it comes down to culture, and giving people ownership in the outcomes is really, really important in my view. Empowering people is really, really important. Not punishing people for a failure if it's something they're trying. You can't innovate. A lot of institutions will try to manage innovation. Innovation is difficult to manage. It's very organic, right? And if you try to overmanage it too much, you're not going to wind up with innovation at all. You're going to wind up with bureaucracy that just is talking about innovation. And you also have to be willing, you fail a lot when you're trying to innovate. And if you punish people because, oh, you didn't deliver this on time or whatever, it didn't achieve the milestones that you thought it would, and therefore your bonus is going to be, negligible as a byproduct of that, then they will never innovate again. So you have to reward the effort as much as the accomplishment. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have cataclysmic failure that is clearly due to, lack of performance or something like that, that you don't address that. But it's important to sort of set that tone and to set that type of organizational culture if you really want to succeed. And I think too many firms place an economic target on innovation efforts, and when they don't work out right away, they basically drop them. And which is why the industry as a whole, frankly, hasn't really moved forward in any meaningful way in many, many years. I think it struggles to. Change is tough, and organizations struggle to drive that change.
Yeah, it is the cycle that you've mentioned before, this vicious cycle of short-term fixes, try to innovate, short-term fix by potentially like cutting the budget, mass layoffs, and then try to innovate again. And it's like this vicious cycle, crash diet type of mechanism, which I think potentially resonates with folks today, as we're seeing a lot of layoffs in the industry, alongside these calls for more innovation. So in this context of I think this very relevant context of what we're seeing today, how would you suggest that firms target sustainable long-term innovation strategy?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of this ebb and flow, right, of resources. Firms go through the cycle where, oh, things don't look so good, so we're going to give everybody a headcount target. And we don't necessarily know as leaders, especially large firm. I mean, there's only so much visibility you get into the lower ranks. So you sort of depend on your management hierarchy to feed you the right information, and sometimes they don't even know what's happening, right? So these layoffs tend to be very brute force, blunt instruments. You also wind up sacrificing, frankly, a lot of opportunities that could be differentiated to make sense because you're applying these things with such a broad brush. But then what happens is when things return to normal, now you got all this hiring backfilling. It costs firms more. It doesn't move the needle. It creates tremendous disloyalty amongst staff. If we were to poll the folks on the call who work for some of these firms and ask them how loyal they feel to their firms, it's not. The old days, earlier in my career and before then, I'm sure, there was a certain level of loyalty, that firms felt, and people felt working for firms, that you would survive, you collect your gold watch at the end of retirement or whatever it was. That no longer exists at all. So I think a lot of it comes back to culture. I think it's driving positive operating leverage based on technology as a key. There's so much sneaker net still embedded in processes within financial institutions. Whether it's moving things from one spreadsheet or database to another, and then kind of looking through all these things, doing all this manual work. That's hard to turn on and turn off. And so I think automation is one of the key enablers to help drive more sustainable change. I think that firms can begin to look at, just as they've begun to look at outsourcing technology solutions, right? It used to be in the old days, people would not, like, it had to be mine, it had to be proprietary, it had to be something, that was built in-house. And increasingly, that's no longer the case. Even firms like Blackrock that are notoriously disposed towards building things in-house, are not quite as rigid anymore in terms of utilizing third-party solutions. And so, and you have to be, because again, you're dealing in an industry with fee and margin compression. You can't own every part of the process. You can't do everything well. And there are other parties that can maybe do it better and cheaper and faster than you can. And so therefore, especially if it's not something that differentiates you, it makes sense to do that. Well, the same is true with staffing, right? Just like people have migrated workloads to the cloud and transitioned from a CapEx to an OpEx type of model, staffing is expensive, right? It's not just the cost of compensation, it's the benefits, it's the unemployment insurance, the taxes, it's all these things that accrue. And if you're constantly kind of going like this with your staffing cycles, it exacerbates the problem, because your expenses are through the roof. Now you've got severance, you've got all these other things. So I actually think that we have been transitioning, and it was it was one of the catalysts was COVID, I think, in a meaningful way too, towards more of a gig economy. And there's still gaps, there's still things that have to be addressed, but I think that a lot of these FIs can leverage that gig economy so that they're not constantly sort of oscillating with their staffing cycles. And frankly, they're probably getting, in some cases, more contemporaneous skills than they might otherwise have on their staff, because the staff, as I said, if you focus 85% of your portfolio is on BAU, you just got people doing break, fix, and maintenance stuff. How are you going to develop them to actually, upskill them so they can deal with AI and blockchain and all these other capabilities? It's very small, narrow groups in those organizations that are dealing with that. So I think that it comes back to automation as being one of the big things, and thinking about your staffing models and operating models and all of that to drive sustainable change, so that you're not constantly doing the up and down thing.
And when it comes to bringing in these kind of alternative resources, tapping into the gig economy, as it were, how does Fintova fit into that picture? Where are you positioning yourselves as being partners to financial institutions?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, when I launched Fintova, the idea was that I thought the industry had generally lagged in terms of its digital adoption. And I had been at enough mainstream organizations in some pretty senior roles that I had a pretty good view of what was happening internally, and the challenges of getting things done. And I've also dealt with a lot of consulting firms over the course of my career, typically sitting on the other side of the table, where they're pitching to me. And one of the things that you notice also is that there are some niche firms out there that are quite good at what they do. The big four have the brand recognition. It's more about the nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM type of deal, right? But invariably, a lot of the folks that they put on an engagement are green. They don't really have the subject matter expertise in the industry, or sometimes even in the technology. They may be learning on the job, and you're paying a pretty hefty margin for those staff, for those consulting staff, when they land on your doorstep. So Fintova, we are not lifelong consultants. We're kind of proud of that, actually, right? We've been in the industry, rising up through very senior level roles in the industry at very, mainstream institutions as well as hedge funds, and that's kind of our secret sauce. Is we know how the sausage is made internally. We understand how these organizations work. We understand how to get things through, despite any impediments that you may come across. We understand. We have a macro view of. Remember, I said earlier, macro view is really important. So we have a macro view of what's happening in the industry and where the puck is moving. So we can help with strategy, we can help with execution, and we also bring not just the technology, leadership and skill sets to the table, but transformation is not a technology project. Transformation is a business project, and a lifestyle, maybe you could argue. And so you have to make sure that you've got, those business subject matter experts fully engaged, and not just engaged because it's their job, but because they have ownership, because they want to see change happen, and they can kind of, they have a North Star that they can see, and how do we get there collectively. And so I think that those things are really important, and that's what we provide. We provide those disciplines in as well as the technology discipline. So interim leadership and fractional leadership and strategy and delivery, and you name it, front to back.
Fantastic. No, thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that that's useful information for a lot of the folks on the call here. And I think we're also now going to take this moment to transition a little bit to some questions from the audience. So if you have a question for Gary about any topic he's discussed here, AI, blockchain, digital transformation in the asset management industry, Aladdin, working with Fintova, anything that comes to mind, please pop it into the chat, and I'll be selecting questions to ask Gary. And in the meantime, while folks are kind of getting their questions ready, I do also just want to let everyone know that this webinar series is part of the Digital Asset Leader community, which is a newly launched community that also includes a newsletter, includes research and insights pertaining to doing business in the digital asset industry. So if you are an entrepreneur or an executive in the digital asset industry and you want to keep getting these sorts of insights, and you also want to talk with others in the space, share knowledge, ask questions, if that interests you, then please reach out to me about joining the community, hopping on the newsletter. You can either mention this in the chat. You can say yes, more info in the chat, or you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you're not already following me on LinkedIn, I'll pop my LinkedIn profile into the chat. And Gary, also please feel free to pop your LinkedIn profile into the chat. And also, if people want to get in touch about learning more about Fintova, would you like to let them know what the best way to do that is?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, fintova.com. We also put out a monthly newsletter called Perspectives. We have about 2,500 or so subscribers to that right now. And each month we try to cover a headline topic. AI is a big one lately, of course. The most recent edition covered what was happening at Miami Hedge Fund Week. For those of you like me who are Floridians now, I'm a new Floridian. So we cover all of that stuff as well. And on the website in the footer, there's a link where you can go and subscribe to that. Additionally, we have a LinkedIn page for Fintova as well. Those articles ultimately make their way to the LinkedIn page too, and as well as other content. And you can certainly reach out to me directly, and I'm more than happy to point you in the right direction with things.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So it looks like we have our first question for Gary, which is, what are a couple of AI applications that you've seen in the fintech world that have impressed you and that are beyond the hype, i.e. working great in production?
It's early days, but again, I would say you have to separate Gen AI, right, from other elements of AI. So there are a number of applications that use AI, natural language processing, to comb through all sorts of financial documents, corporate earnings, those kinds of things, sentiment analysis, reading through all sorts of periodicals and publications to derive, sentiment on a particular company. Those things have been around for a bit now. Bloomberg has incorporated, I think they call it Bloomberg GPT or something like that, in their terminal product as well. And so those are the use cases right now. In terms of Gen AI, which is the thing that's exciting, I think, most people. And again, it's the reason that's exciting most people. We probably wouldn't be having this talk about AI if we were still dealing with kind of the machine learning and predictive analytics side of it. But the reason that Gen AI has excited most people is because of the human interface, because of the fact that it feels like you're talking to a person, that they can create content that feels like it was authored by somebody new, or create an image that was looks like a work of art, or poems, or whatever. That's why Gen AI is so exciting. There are challenges to use it in the industry, but I think that it'll be used for all sorts of stuff, from doing investor commentary, things like that. It'll generate. You're seeing it increasingly embedded in a lot of SaaS applications as well, AI capabilities. And I've seen it in CRMs at this point, and I've seen it in a couple of trading applications at this point, some risk management applications. Company Riskfan, I see Sarut Dagli is one of the listeners here, has begun to do some stuff with AI as well in their products, so worth checking out.
Wonderful. I am trying to get some clarification from TimeEd on his question, which is, how do you compare it to the new Sora? Sora is the new AI video generator, I believe. And if I were to interpret it, I'm thinking he means application of AI in asset management. So I guess my interpretation of the question is, if you look at video generation and the AI leaps and bounds that are happening in the area of creating media and creating video, how does that compare with use cases of AI in asset management?
Well, if you're looking at using that type of generative AI for asset management, I think it comes back a lot to sort of customer service, right? So how do you interface with your investors and your clients? How do you make an environment that speaks directly to them in the language that they want, in the way in which they want, and that also incorporates all the information about their portfolios or their investment strategies or interests or so forth. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to replace some of the traditional call center capabilities that you see with AI, and not just the kind of you've all encountered the chats that they can't answer anything. And then ultimately, whether it's on a phone or on a chat board, you're trying to get a real person to answer. But I think some of this stuff will ultimately come around to the point where it can be automated fairly nicely and have a nice interaction with the end user. So I think that's an opportunity for sure.
Yeah, totally agree. And really excited to see kind of how all of these the consumer world impacts implementation of AI.
Well, everything, right? I mean, user experience, right? So I had written an article years ago that's still available on the website for anyone interested, declaring that UI is, user experience generally is the new alpha. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult for firms to differentiate themselves on investment performance these days. Most firms have a lot of the same strategies. There's sometimes a crowd, in certain investments, and so, very few of them are top performers on a regular basis. So how do you make that more sticky? And I think a lot of it is user experience. So a number of years ago, I had a conversation with the chief investment officer of T Rowe, and it was at a conference that I was speaking at, and I made this claim that I thought alpha, that UX was sort of the new alpha, and he came up to me and he vehemently disagreed, and he said, no, that it's all about investment performance. And I said, well, again, investment performance is fairly stable across like managers. Yes, there are some outsized performers out there, and they clearly demand attention. But generally speaking, it's a pretty flat line, across different parties. So I said to him, let me ask you a question. I said, are you an Amazon Prime member? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, why are you an Amazon Prime member? And he said, well, he went into all the RMA, capabilities, and he talked about, the content and the media that's available there, and then next day shipping, and all those things. And I said, not once did you mention price of goods, which is the corollary to investment performance. It's the economic, factor of Amazon. You didn't mention that once. And I said, and truth is, Amazon's not always the cheapest. So what you talked about was the user experience. And so I think the same applies to investment management too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things so when I was working at BNY Mellon, a lot of the area of focus was how clients, due to the fact that consumer experiences were becoming better and better, just clients in general expected more out of that consumer experience. And I think we're going to only see that, that trend become more intense with AI. So we're going to take, let's see, we have one more question for now, and then we will probably look to wrap it up in case anyone else wants to pop in any last questions they have. We'll take one or two more questions. So this is a question from Ashish. Gary, you mentioned alpha generation might be potentially an area of interest for Gen AI or AI at large. Are you aware of any actual projects or pilots being undertaken that leverage Gen AI for alpha generation or even signal identification? Or are there any fintechs that are working on that?
Well, the systematic firms are closest to the sun, right, in terms of AI, because they have been using machine learning and signal generation for quite a while in their core investment strategies and theses, right? So, so that's where I think you're going to find the organizations that are. This is sort of a natural progression for them. Now, whether Gen AI by itself, and remember, Gen AI is about creativity. So Gen AI can take into account. Let me take a step back because there's a couple of things to think about with Gen AI, right? Large language models are static. Even if you fine tune a large language model with other information that is more relevant to your particular industry or business, right? Yes, it's additive to the large language model. It gives it, it expands its corpus to include that, but it's still static. Ultimately, you have to find ways in which to tie that information. You can think of large language model almost as a translator. Tie that information back into the knowledge that is contemporaneous, which could include market data, could include other assets in your organization as well. And there are approaches to do that. Whether it's using RAG or agents or things like that. It's something that I generally refer to as knowledge transfer within the AI world. And how do you move that data back and forth? And so before you can even get going with Gen AI to use it for something, let's say a contemporaneous trade idea, you have to be able to feed it the information. And then it can spit it out to you in a human-like way. It can digest that information and provide context around it that makes sense from an execution standpoint. And that's where I think it can be used in terms of AlphaGen. But it all comes back to the data architectures. How are you integrating all that contemporary knowledge, all of that history of your organization into a foundational model that was not trained on it? And so that's the trick. That's the real opportunity with AI. It's not typing something into ChatGPT and letting it run based on the corpus against which it was trained. It's really being able to integrate your data assets into that overall life cycle. That's really important.
Very, very insightful, Gary. So we are just about out of time and also out of questions. So we are going to wrap it up for now, but I do want to really, truly thank Gary for sharing his insights. I think it's so nice when we can have someone who has seen it all, lived it all from inside of various asset management firms and financial services firms, and share with us a little bit about what digital transformation looked like in the past, what it looks like now, and what it's going to look like in the future. It's invaluable for us to come together and be able to exchange this kind of knowledge. So thank you so much, Gary.
Oh, thanks, Jeannette. And I would part with the saying again, always think about where the puck is moving. That's how you're going to be, you're going to make a difference in this industry and other industries. Always think about where the puck is moving.
Fantastic. And on that note, we are going to wrap it up for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.